In 89 BC, in the heat of June, at the front hall of Weiyang Palace in Chang'an, the sky had not yet fully brightened, but official carriages were already crowding outside the palace gates. Ministers in black court robes moved up the stone steps and gathered before the hall. Their footsteps were deliberately quiet. No one spoke loudly. Yet an unspoken excitement ran through them all. News had come from inside the palace the night before. Today, the emperor would issue an edict deciding the matter of military farming at Luntai in the west. Luntai lay far away between desert and oasis, thousands of li from the imperial heartland. Ordinary farmers might live their whole lives without ever knowing where it was. But on the maps in Chang'an, it had already been circled. The officials, led by the chancellor, had previously submitted a memorial recommending that the empire station troops there to farm the land and build it into a firm foothold beyond the frontier. Soldiers could guard the area while cultivating fields, becoming self-sufficient and preparing for future expeditions. To many people at court, this was a procedure the empire had repeated for decades: expedition, garrison, military farming, then the establishment of frontier commanderies. In the end, an unfamiliar piece of land on the map would be fixed in place by officials, troops, roads, taxes and law. Generals won merit through expeditions. Officials gained promotion by organizing grain supplies. Frontier aristocrats expanded their power through military farms and transport contracts. So when the officials lined up inside the hall, many assumed that today would simply be the formal announcement of another plan moving forward. The emperor on the throne said little. With a slight wave of his hand, a palace attendant stepped out from the side of the hall, holding the imperial edict. The great hall fell instantly silent. No one dared raise his head. Only the rustle of sleeves could be heard, along with a heavy echo of the distant palace gates closing. The voice rang out across the empty hall. Everyone froze. The edict said that the officers in charge had once proposed increasing taxes on the people to help fund the frontier armies. That, the emperor said, would only make life harder for the elderly, the weak, orphans and poor households. Now, others were requesting that soldiers be sent to farm at Luntai. But Luntai lay far to the west, extremely distant from the empire's center of control. To farm there, people would have to be sent there. Grain would have to be sent there. Tools would have to be sent there. Fortified relay stations and beacon towers would have to be built. This, the emperor declared, would exhaust and disturb the empire. It would not nourish the people. This time, the hall was not merely quiet. It was dead silent. At last, some people understood. Today's edict was not an approval of the Luntai plan. It was a rejection. Those who had been waiting for the plan to pass were unable to react. The faces of frontier officials changed. The shoulders of military aristocrats stiffened. Fiscal officials lowered their heads even further. They understood what the edict truly meant. The emperor was not rejecting one minor proposal. He was rejecting the momentum that had built up over decades. The reader did not stop. The edict mentioned the failed Western expedition. The general who had once campaigned against the distant kingdom of Dayuan, brought back famous horses, and been ennobled among the highest ranks of the aristocracy, had later led another army beyond the frontier, only to be defeated and surrender. Soldiers had died, scattered, and been captured by the enemy. The emperor said these matters often filled him with grief. Yet now, some still wanted to recruit convicts and send them out in pursuit of revenge. Others still wanted to use the promise of marquisate to tempt soldiers into chasing more military glory for the court. The emperor refused. This, he said, was not what the empire should be doing now. By the end of the edict, the voice became even clearer. The most urgent task now was to stop cruel and abusive officials prevent local authorities from adding unauthorized taxes, return the people to the foundations of agriculture, restore the horse breeding system, make up the state shortages, and maintain necessary defenses, not to keep dragging the empire down with endless expeditions. The ministers kneeling in the hall finally understood. This emperor, who had ruled the world for 50 years, this emperor, whose entire life had been defined by relentless advance, had for the first time called a halt. And he had admitted that the policies of the past had gone wrong. The officials lay prostrate in the hall, foreheads close to the floor. Sweat ran down some of their faces and fell onto the stone slabs. They were still trying to digest this political reversal that none of them had expected. They were terrified, uneasy, and perhaps even unwilling to accept it. But they did not know that this edict, later known as the Luntai Edict of Self-Reproach, would become one of the most important imperial edicts in thousands of years of Chinese imperial history. It would become the model for the Edict of Self-Reproach. In historical significance, it was in some ways no less important than the decades of territorial expansion carried out by this emperor. Without this edict, and without the emergency brake applied to expansion in the emperor's final years, the Han Empire might well have entered a rapid decline immediately after reaching the height of its power. And this emperor, Emperor Wu of Han, might have been remembered only as another tyrant in history, condemned for grandiosity, violence, and reckless ambition. Today, let us trace the legendary life of Emperor Wu of Han, one of the greatest conquerors in Chinese history. Let us examine what he gained and what he lost, and feel both the triumph and the sorrow of his life. Liu Che, the future Emperor Wu of Han, was not originally destined to sit on the throne. The previous heir was the emperor's eldest son, but that prince's mother rudely rejected a marriage alliance proposed by the emperor's elder sister. Deeply humiliated and furious, the Grand Princess quickly changed her target. She chose another consort, and that consort's young son, Liu Che, and married her own daughter to him. To support her son-in-law's rise, the Grand Princess used her privilege of easy access to the emperor to repeatedly slander the Crown Prince's mother and constantly praise the gentleness of Liu Che's mother and the intelligence of Liu Che himself. In the end, after a series of intrigues, the former Crown Prince was deposed and sent away from the capital. The young Liu Che was made the new heir. In 141 BC, the old emperor died, and 16-year-old Liu Che ascended the throne in Weiyang Palace. What Emperor Wu inherited was a vast empire that had enjoyed decades of recovery. A prosperous economy, full granaries, and a rapidly growing population. The policy left by the previous two emperors was clear: intervene less, conscript less, wage fewer wars, lower agricultural taxes, abolish complicated and harsh laws, and allow the private economy to repair itself. For an empire that had only recently recovered from civil war and the trauma of its founding, this approach had once been extremely effective. But in the eyes of the young emperor, surface prosperity could not hide the empire's deeper crises. Powerful nomadic enemies in the north crossed the border every few years, burning villages and carrying away people. The kings in the east and south of the empire still possessed their own armies and tax systems. And inside the capital, the person truly pressing down on the emperor was not any minister, but his grandmother, an old blind woman of the imperial family who still held the highest power of judgment. She was no ordinary elderly royal. She was Emperor Wu's own grandmother. As a young woman, she had entered the palace from a poor family. She later followed her husband to the position of empress, survived decades of political storms, and became the empire's real supreme arbiter. Like her husband, She firmly believed in Huang Lao thought. The ruler should be like the way of heaven, quiet and non-interfering, reducing intervention in society, reducing war and taxation, and allowing the people to recover. To be fair, this philosophy had achieved great success under the previous two emperors. But as the empire's strength recovered, in her hands it had quietly changed. It was no longer merely a good medicine for governing and stabilizing the state. It had become a shackle that suppressed political innovation and protected the vested interests of the imperial in-laws. Once, an elderly Confucian scholar criticized the ideas she believed in inside the palace. She flew into a rage and ordered this frail old man, who could not even bind a chicken, to be thrown into the imperial pigsty and made to fight wild boars with his bare hands. Everyone nearby understood that this was not a joke. It was a warning. While she was alive, no new idea could easily cross her authority. The young emperor did not want to remain a decoration of this old order. Soon after ascending the throne, he began gathering scholars who spoke of ancient ritual, the hierarchy between ruler and minister, and the ideal of a unified empire. He hoped to reshape the government with new ideas. He ordered local officials to recommend upright men who dared speak frankly, and he personally presided over examinations for young scholars. Two reformist officials, deeply trusted by him, began promoting new court rituals and offered an extremely dangerous proposal. The emperor should no longer consult his blind grandmother on every matter. This proposal struck at the heart of the issue. It was not about ceremony, it was about power. But the emperor was too young. His grandmother's counterattack came swiftly, coldly, and without hesitation. She bypassed the emperor, mobilized her foundations among imperial in-laws and conservative officials, collected charges against the two reform leaders, and threw them into death row. Facing this sudden thunderbolt of anger, the young emperor discovered that although he was nominally the ruler of all under heaven, he did not have a core guard force truly loyal only to him. Nor did he have enough ministers willing to stand up for him. He could only yield and watch helplessly as the people he trusted most were driven to death in prison. The first round of reform ended in blood and fear. Ideas alone could not change the empire. To change the empire, one first had to control violence. In the years that followed, Liu Che put on the mask of a pleasure-seeking ruler uninterested in government. He often changed into plain clothes, dressed like an ordinary nobleman, and slipped out of the heavily guarded capital with a small group of attendants. He hunted and traveled through mountains, forests, and countryside, and sometimes even spent the night in private homes. In the eyes of conservative ministers, this seemed like a young man crushed by failure and sinking into indulgence. But the real change was taking place in the Imperial Hunting Park southwest of the capital. At first, it was merely a hunting ground left over from an earlier age. But under his secret expansion, it gradually became a vast military and cultural complex stretching for hundreds of li. There, under the pretext of hunting and defending against wild beasts, he recruited low-born warriors, orphans, and lower-ranking cavalrymen, forming a private guard that bypassed the traditional military system and owed loyalty only to the emperor himself. At the same time, in the court at the capital, the imperial in-law factions were still fighting over the empire's resources. The emperor's uncle rose rapidly, greedy, arrogant, and domineering. He used his special status to build cliques and pursue private gain. When the Yellow River burst its banks and floods spread, he even obstructed the building of embankments simply because the disaster area did not threaten his own fief. On the other side, the old power of the grandmother's family had not yet left the stage. The old and new generations of imperial in-laws fought fiercely at court, framing and tearing at each other. On the surface, the young emperor seemed unable to restrain his uncle's arrogance and allowed him to push the representatives of the old in-law faction toward death. But in reality, he was watching tigers fight from a mountain. He was waiting for the moment that would truly decide the empire's fate. In 135 BC, that moment finally arrived. The blind old royal woman who had dominated the court died in Xiongnu Palace. As the most steadfast defender of the old political philosophy closed her eyes, the chains around the emperor shattered. The atmosphere of the court changed immediately. The emperor's mother and his still powerful uncle wanted to continue influencing politics, but they soon discovered that they did not have the old woman's legal and moral seniority to suppress the emperor. Liu Che stepped out from behind the curtain and onto the stage. He used the trusted forces he had trained in the hunting park to take control of the capital's defenses. Through a swift reshuffling of personnel, he pushed out of the core of power those old ministers who could do nothing but preach, do less, change less. Then he recalled the scholars who spoke of ritual, ruler-minister order, and national unity, turning their classics into a path for selecting officials and their language into the official language of the empire. But he did not build a warm and moral state. Beneath this elegant robe of ritual, he preserved and strengthened harsh law, surveillance networks, and an efficient bureaucratic machine. What he wanted was not the dream of scholars, but a centralized empire that could command, tax, conscript, judge, and expand. By this point, the restrained era left by the previous two emperors had ended. This young man no longer intended to live peacefully on the granaries his ancestors had filled. He had new ideas, a new guard, new officials, and new preparations for war. Next, he would push this recovered empire toward the northern steppe. In 133 BC, the young emperor finally reached toward the north. Before this, the empire had endured for many years. Whenever cavalry from the northern grasslands rode south, beacon fires would rise along the frontier towns. Farmers fled behind city walls. Local officials sealed the granaries. Garrison troops waited in yellow earth and cold wind for the impact. Ministers in the capital had grown used to this rhythm. The enemy came, gifts were sent, marriage alliances were arranged, negotiations were held, concessions were made. Then the enemy left, the frontier repaired its walls, and everyone waited for the next year. Earlier emperors chose this policy not because they were weak, but because an empire just emerging from civil war needed recovery. Fields mattered more than battlefields. Granaries mattered more than glory. But now the storehouses were full, the population had recovered, and the state had horses, money, and men. The emperor no longer wanted to entrust the empire's security to the enemy's appetite. He planned an ambush of annihilation. The location was a small city on the northern frontier. The empire deliberately set out bait, preparing to lure the main force of the steppe power into a trap and destroy it in one stroke. If the plan succeeded, decades of humiliation might have ended in a single day. But at the last moment, the news leaked. 100,000 steppe cavalrymen raced back north, and years of patient preparation vanished into nothing. The retaliation that followed was swift and brutal. From the northeast to the northwest, enemy cavalry launched attacks along thousands of kilometers of frontier at the same time. They no longer merely plundered villages. They drove deep into the interior, captured cities, slaughtered garrisons, and carried away people. More than 60 years of peace efforts were destroyed in a few months. The capital was shaken. Sitting in his palace before maps and sand tables, the emperor finally saw the heart of the problem. The Han army did not know how to fight on the steppe. Once troops went beyond the frontier, the vast grassland had no roads, no cities, no directions, and no supply lines. Steppe cavalry did not need supply lines. They lived on horseback. If you went looking for them, you would lose your way on the grasslands. If you did not look for them, they would appear at your front door. 4 years later, the enemy rode south again. Frontier garrisons collapsed, and Xiongnu was in danger. The emperor made a decision. No more defense. The empire would strike first. He sent out 4 armies at the same time. The first was led by the empire's most famous veteran general. The other commanders were also respectable figures at court. But the commander of the 4th army surprised everyone. His name was Wei Qing. He came from a humble background. Previously, he had been little more than a cavalry slave in a noble household, responsible for raising horses, preparing horses, and leading horses. When his master went hunting, he even had to kneel on the ground as a mounting block. Later, because his sister was taken into the palace by the emperor, he entered the margins of power. To aristocratic generals, such an origin was almost beneath notice. But what the emperor saw was not pedigree. He thought, this man had been a horse slave. He knew what land without roads was like. He knew hunger, wind, and losing one's way. He knew how to track, how to make detours, and how to complete an encirclement in open country. After the 4 armies went beyond the frontier, bad news came back, one report after another. The veteran general was surrounded, his entire army destroyed, and he himself was captured before escaping back. Another force suffered a major defeat, losing 7,000 of its 10,000 cavalry. Another simply wandered around the grassland and returned without achievement. Only the 4th army sent no news. The wait in the capital grew long. Then Wei Qing returned. He had not advanced slowly along the traditional route. Instead, he had driven straight into the heart of the steppe and found the enemy's ritual center. It was not a city, but the sacred ground where steppe nobles sacrificed to heaven and their ancestors. Han cavalry suddenly appeared on the horizon, charged into the camp, scattered the guards, burned the altars, seized spoils, and quickly returned south. The scale of this victory was not large, but its meaning was entirely different. For the first time, the Han army proved that it could enter the steppe on its own initiative, find the enemy, and come back alive. The emperor did not stop. In 127 BC, he turned his eyes to the grasslands south of the Yellow River. This region was less than 400 li from the capital. It was a dagger pointed at the empire's chest. From there, enemy cavalry could reach the gates of the imperial palaces within 10 days. The emperor decided to pull out this dagger. He sent Wei Qing out again. Wei Qing did not push forward head-on. Instead, he left the frontier from the northern commanderies, suddenly turned west, marched rapidly along the northern bank of the Yellow River, and circled behind the entire region. Along the way, there were no Han strongholds and no stable supply lines, only a cavalry force constantly moving forward. The enemy commander had no time to react. He could only flee north with his personal guards. His people, cattle, sheep, and the entire land fell into Han hands. The emperor immediately established new frontier commanderies there, moved large numbers of settlers into the region, and built cities and fortifications. The border was no longer just a line on a map. It began to be fixed in place by troops, farmland, offices, and walls. This was the famous Hetao region of present-day China. Then came the campaign south of the Gobi. A great western noble of the enemy withdrew to the lands south of the desert, assuming the Han army would never chase him so far. He was wrong. Wei Qing led his army out at night, forced marched hundreds of li, and arrived at the enemy camp in the darkness before dawn. This was not a long battle. It was a sudden, crushing blow. The enemy commander abandoned his soldiers, wives and concubines, grain and livestock, fleeing north with only a few hundred personal guards. Everything else fell into Wei Qing's hands. More than 10 high-ranking nobles, 15,000 ordinary people, and hundreds of thousands of animals. When the news reached the capital, the emperor could not wait for Wei Qing to return to Chang'an. He sent an envoy directly beyond the frontier to welcome the victorious army and appointed Wei Qing in the camp itself as the empire's supreme military commander. The man who had once knelt beside a stable to saddle horses now held the heaviest military authority in the entire empire. But the emperor needed more than a steady commander. He also needed a faster, sharper blade, one that almost ignored convention. In 123 BC, a 17-year-old youth followed Wei Qing on campaign. His name was Huo Qubing. He was Wei Qing's nephew and also the emperor's nephew. As a young noble raised in the palace, the emperor gave him 800 cavalry, apparently just to let him gain experience. But when the main force suffered setbacks, a commander defected, and the atmosphere in camp sank to freezing point, this young man disappeared. A few days later, he returned to camp with his 800 men. What he brought back were more than 2,000 enemy heads. With a lone force, he had raided hundreds of li into enemy territory, struck deep into the enemy heartland, killed high officials, captured nobles alive, and seized figures of ministerial rank. The emperor directly created a title that had never existed before and made him Marquis Champion. This was not an ordinary reward. It was the emperor's recognition of a new way of war. Speed mattered more than formation. Surprise mattered more than defense. And courage at times mattered more than experience. 2 years later, 19-year-old Huo Qubing commanded 10,000 elite cavalry on his own. His target was the Hexi Corridor, the long, narrow passage between desert, mountains, and steppe, and the empire's gateway to the Western world. Older generals were used to infantry and chariots in formation. Against steppe cavalry, that model was heavy and slow. Wei Qing had already changed the Han army, but he still needed large baggage trains and a rear. Huo Qubing was more extreme. This time, the 10,000 elite cavalry he led had not a single infantryman. He almost recklessly abandoned supply lines and relied on feeding the army from the enemy. Wherever he fought, he took food and horses from enemy tribes. He turned his force into an attack group with no attachments, no rear, only speed and killing power. Within 6 days, he marched at extreme speed, defeated 5 steppe kingdoms in succession, crossed the Yanzi Mountains, and cut through the Hexi Corridor, striking again and again from directions the enemy had not imagined. The Xiongnu were badly defeated. Even their precious golden statue, used in sacrifices to heaven, was captured and sent back to the capital as a trophy. After a brief pause, the emperor ordered Huo Qubing to strike again. The allied force that was supposed to coordinate the attack lost its way, leaving Huo Qubing alone. A normal commander would have withdrawn. He chose to attack. Beneath the Qilian Mountains, he defeated the enemy head-on and captured royal clan members, noblewomen, generals, and high officials. The military power of the Hexi Corridor was almost wiped out. On the grasslands, laments began to be sung over the loss of the Qilian and Yanzi Mountains. In 119 BC, the emperor decided to launch the final showdown. The general-in-chief Wei Qing and the cavalry general Huo Qubing each led 50,000 elite cavalry, advancing into the far north of the Gobi from east and west. Behind them were hundreds of thousands of infantry and labourers, grain carts, horses, roads, and the entire fiscal capacity of the empire. The emperor even used the imperial family's private horses to ensure the cavalry supply at the front. This was a battle that gambled with the fate of the state. Wei Qing's target was the enemy's supreme leader. Hua Qubing's target was the main force of the eastern wing. After crossing the desert, Wei Qing discovered that the enemy had already formed ranks and was waiting. He won, but the encirclement failed. The enemy's supreme leader escaped. Han losses were heavy. A veteran general with great achievements was blamed for losing his way and eventually killed himself. The Western army had won, but it was covered in wounds. Hua Qubing continued in his usual style. Full speed north, completely separated from the rear, crossing desert and rivers, driving straight into the enemy's heartland. He found the main force of the eastern wing and fought a cavalry battle. Then he climbed the enemy's sacred mountain and sacrificed to heaven. He went on to another mountain and sacrificed to earth, carving the empire's victory into the deepest part of the steppe. After the war, the powerful enemy in the north fled far away. South of the Gobi, they no longer had a royal court. The emperor had finally completed the goal of his youth. He no longer waited for the enemy to ride south. He pushed the war back into the enemy's own world. Although the Xiongnu problem had not been completely solved, the balance of the Han-Xiongnu war had fundamentally shifted. While the northern steppe was being torn open by one expedition after another, the emperor's eyes also turned toward other directions on the empire's map. For an agricultural empire facing a powerful nomadic enemy in the north, training cavalry, crossing deserts, and launching expeditions deep into the grasslands was only half of Emperor Wu's military achievement. One might even say it was not the half that most changed China's future. If the camera moves away for a moment from the northern frontier of the Han Empire and turns toward the south, southeast, southwest, and northeast, we see expansions of similar scale and perhaps even deeper long-term impact. There were fewer cavalry showdowns there, no heroic ceremony like the sacrifice at Mount Langjushu, and no dazzling military stars shining in the Chang'an court. But almost at the same time as the decisive wars against the Xiongnu, Emperor Wu was also sending armies in every direction, turning these regions from spheres of imperial influence into parts of the imperial administrative system. In the south, the first kingdom pushed before the emperor was Nanyue, the kingdom of the far south. It controlled the region of today's Guangdong, Guangxi, and northern Vietnam, with its capital near present-day Guangzhou. This was not a remote little tribe. It was a frontier kingdom that controlled Lingnan, connected to the South China Sea, and influenced the Pearl River Basin and northern Vietnam. Whoever controlled this place controlled the gateway from the Central Plains to the world of the Southern Seas. This kingdom, founded by a rebel general of the Qin dynasty, had nominally submitted to the Han. But submission in name did not mean direct rule. The Han court could not govern its capital as it governed Guangzhou, Henan, or Shandong. It could not appoint its officials at will, directly collect its taxes, or truly control its army. For the early Han court, this situation had once been tolerable. There was a powerful enemy in the north, kings within the Central Plains, and the empire had just recovered from war. Lingnan was too far away, with too many mountains, a humid climate, and difficult transportation. Instead of launching a costly southern war, it was better to let the kingdom submit in name while governing itself in practice. But in Emperor Wu's time, this compromise could not continue forever. What truly triggered the war was an internal power struggle inside Nanyue. Pro-Han forces within the royal house gradually grew stronger. The young king of Nanyue and the Queen Dowager leaned toward deeper submission, even hoping to bring the kingdom under direct Han control. But this decision touched the fundamental interests of the native aristocracy. An old minister who held real power had long controlled the court. His clan was deeply rooted, and he had strong marriage ties with the royal family and the nobles. He did not want to see a relatively independent kingdom become ordinary commanderies and counties under Han administration. Court conflict escalated quickly. In the end, he launched a coup, killed pro-Han royal members and Han envoys. At that moment, the southern problem was no longer a diplomatic issue. It had become an open challenge to imperial authority. Chang'an answered quickly. In 112 BC, Emperor Wu decided on a southern campaign. The Han court mobilized a large army and advanced along multiple routes toward the southern capital. From the north, the 5 ridges looked like a natural barrier separating the central plains from Lingnan. But this barrier was not impossible to cross. Han armies moved south from several directions. Some crossed the mountains, some advanced along rivers, and some pressured the southern kingdom from the west. One naval force broke through passes and pushed into the interior. Another main force carried the burden of frontal pressure and political surrender efforts. This was not a brute force advance along a single route, but a pincer campaign that used rivers, passes, and local forces. Nanyue did not hold out for long. When Han troops approached Panyu, today's Guangzhou, the situation inside the city quickly collapsed. The king and the rebellious old minister tried to flee, but were eventually captured by Han forces. A southern kingdom that had lasted nearly a century came to an end. In 111 BC, the Han established a series of commanderies and counties there. Officials arrived. Household registers arrived. Taxes, roads, military posts, and legal order followed. The south was no longer just a humid, distant, semi-independent world at the edge of the Central Plains map. It began to become a place the imperial system could reach. More importantly, the fall of the southern kingdom opened the empire's gate to the sea. By controlling Lingnan, it controlled the key outlet from the Central Plains to the South China Sea. After the Han occupied the region, coastal ports quickly rose in importance. They were not only administrative bases, but also early maritime nodes leading toward the South China Sea, Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean. For a dynasty traditionally centered on the Yellow River, Guangdong and the North China Plain, this was an entirely new spatial experience. For the first time, the Han Empire faced the South China Sea more directly. Monsoons, ports, pearls, spices, and long-distance maritime trade. Of course, none of this was completed overnight. The deep development of Lingnan would take a long historical process. But Emperor Wu's destruction of the southern kingdom was indeed one of the key starting points of that long process. It provided the earliest imperial institutional framework for later southward migration, the development of Lingnan, maritime trade, and the rise of the southern economy. After the southern capital fell, another uneasy kingdom among the mountains and seas of the southeast watched its fate closely. This kingdom lay hidden among the mountains, valleys, and coasts of today's Fujian, southern Zhejiang, and eastern Jiangxi. It was called Minyue. This region was not open like the North China Plain, nor was it as suitable for large formations as Guangdong. Its mountain roads were rugged, its streams crisscrossed, and its passes were narrow. For armies from the Central Plains, this was not a battlefield for rapid advance. It was a complex terrain that swallowed speed, consumed supplies, and created ambushes. This southeastern kingdom was close to the sea, yet hidden behind mountains. It could communicate with the outside world while using the highlands for defense. To the Han Empire, it was not a direct border threat like the northern steppe enemy, but it was an even more difficult southeastern danger. As long as it existed, the southeastern coast would always contain a local kingdom not fully obedient to the center. In 111 BC, the ruler of Minyue saw the fall of Nanyue. He understood that the emperor was no longer satisfied with the old loose relationship of nominal submission. A frontier kingdom that had once accepted investiture and maintained surface peace had still been invaded by Han armies, its capital taken and its autonomy abolished. So he did not wait. He rebelled first, even usurping the title of emperor, and attacked Han-controlled territory. For him, this was a dangerous gamble. For Emperor Wu, it was not an isolated incident, but the last hard stone in the order of the southeastern frontier. If the south had been destroyed, but the southeastern mountain kingdom could still remain separatist, then the conquest of the south would still be incomplete. Han armies soon attacked from multiple directions. This war also required coordination between land and water forces, and it too required crossing mountains and waterways. But here there was no clear royal capital target like the Southern Kingdom's capital, nor was there a relatively open route like the Pearl River Basin. Han armies faced a defensive space woven from mountains and sea. Troops crossing the river from the north had to pass through layers of mountains. Naval forces had to search along rivers and coasts for landing points and inland routes. Local surrendered forces were used to tear open cracks inside the kingdom. On such a battlefield, victory did not depend only on numbers. The terrain itself was Minyue's ally. Mountain roads were narrow, making it difficult for large armies to deploy. The forests were damp, exhausting soldiers and spreading disease. Ravines and passes were ideal for ambushes. Every step forward required a price in logistics and time. Cavalry raids, common in the northern wars, lost their meaning here. The Han had to use a slower, heavier, and crueler method, pressing imperial power bit by bit into the depths of the mountains. Finally, in 110 BC, Minyue collapsed from within. Its ruler was killed by internal forces, and the kingdom surrendered to Han. But Emperor Wu did not simply preserve the old lands and allow local nobles to continue governing. Instead, the empire took more extreme measures. It moved the local population on a large scale, leaving the old territory temporarily emptied. This was not merely the destruction of a kingdom. It was the removal of the social foundations of separatism in the southeastern mountains through forced migration and political dismantling. Migration was not an abstract command. It meant that many families left familiar mountains, rivers, ancestral graves and local communities, and were forced to move closer to Han's centers of control. For the empire, this was a security strategy. For those who were moved, it was a rupture of fate. Beyond the south and southeast, the emperor also turned his eyes to the southwest. This was not a single country, nor an enemy that could be conquered in one stroke. It was an extremely complex world of mountains and plateaus, stronger local regimes, kingdoms by lakes, tribes of different sizes and local chiefs. The southwest entered Emperor Wu's strategic vision from a very small beginning, a jar of sauce from Shu. A Han envoy discovered it at a banquet in the southern kingdom and realized that beyond formal Han control, there already existed a route connecting Bashu, the southwest, and Lingnan. So envoys were sent to the southwest. The emperor's strategy was clear. First, obtain nominal submission through diplomacy and gifts. Then, by establishing commanderies and counties, building roads and sending officials, gradually turn loose submission into real control. The Han would not treat every local chief as an enemy from the start. It would use rivalries among local powers, winning over some and suppressing others. First, certain chiefs would accept Han titles. Then the commandery and county system would gradually reach deeper. Through this combination of favors and force, the southwestern region of present-day China was gradually brought into Han rule. Next came the northeast, where another frontier kingdom was drawn into the same logic. This was Wiman Joseon, a state actually ruled by a fugitive from Yan. It was located beyond Liaodong and in the northern part of the Korean peninsula, connecting the Han Empire's northeastern frontier, the Liaodong region, the peoples of the northern peninsula, and regional trade networks. The early Han court had hoped it could exist as a buffer, but it could not tolerate Wiman Joseon monopolizing the routes by which smaller northeastern states reached the Han. After a diplomatic conflict, the situation completely broke down. Emperor Wu decided to solve it by war. In 109 BC, the Han expedition advanced by land and sea. One army pushed forward from Liaodong, while another crossed the sea from the Shandong Peninsula and drove toward the royal capital. The Han army demonstrated an ability to project force across the sea, but the war did not go smoothly. The sea route army attacked too eagerly, suffered a major defeat, and retreated into the mountains. The land route army favored a direct assault. The two commanders did not trust each other. One wanted negotiation, the other wanted battle. Ministers of Wiman Joseon saw the cracks and tried to delay the war by negotiating surrender separately. In the following year, 108 BC, with new reinforcements and unified command restored, Han finally won. But it was not a clean victory. Outside the royal capital, Han forces faced not only walls and enemy troops, but also conflicts within the expeditionary army itself. Different sources of soldiers, different commanders, and different ideas of warfare. In the end, the nobles within Wiman Joseon split. The ruler was assassinated, and the kingdom fell. After the war, Emperor Wu established 4 northeastern frontier commanderies, extending administrative reach beyond Liaodong and into the northern Korean peninsula. These conquests are far less famous than the wars on the northern steppe. But from the perspective of how China's territory took shape, they may be the key to understanding Emperor Wu's true historical position. He made imperial officials, armies, roads, ports, household registers, taxes, and law begin to enter places that had once existed only vaguely at the edges of the map. For the first time, in such a systematic, forceful, and multi-directional way, he pushed the institutional frontier of the Central Plains dynasty toward the south, southwest, southeast, and northeast. The northern wars shaped the martial image of the Han Empire. These less remembered conquests shaped the geographical outline of China's future. And yet, not every expansion and victory came so easily. In 101 BC, beyond the Jade Gate, an army returned from the west. First came the dust in the distance. Then came horsemen, camel caravans, damaged military banners, and exhausted soldiers. Many of the men no longer had the expression of victors. The wind and sand of the western regions had worn down their armor, and the long road had broken their bodies. Behind them, they had indeed brought back what the emperor wanted: famous horses from the distant kingdom of Dayuan and countless treasures. The commander, Li Guangli, was barely 30 years old. After years of hard fighting beyond the Jade Gate, on an expedition whose round trip exceeded 13,000 kilometers, and after paying the price of tens of thousands of lives, he finally returned to imperial territory with the arrogance of victory. Chang'an rewarded him quickly: a marquisate, a fief of 8,000 households, and entry into the highest ranks of the imperial aristocracy. On the surface, This was another victory of the age of Emperor Wu. But when this army crossed the Jade Gate, the shape of victory already looked strange. It was not like Wei Qing returning in triumph from the north. It was not like Huo Qubing bringing back enemy royals from the depths of the desert. Those victories had been expensive, but they had changed the empire's security situation. The lands south of the Yellow River Bend were recovered, and the dagger at Chang'an's chest was pulled out. The Hersey corridor was opened, and the gate to the west was unlocked. After the decisive battle north of the Gobi, the northern enemy fled far away, and south of the desert there was no longer a royal court. Those wars at least had a clear goal: to allow the empire to breathe without being pressed down by enemies at the frontier. But Daiyuan was different. It was too far away. So far that most Han commoners did not know where it was. So far that it was fundamentally impossible to transport grain there from the interior, because the grain consumed in transport far exceeded what actually reached the front. The imperial army crossed deserts, gravel wastes, and one unfamiliar city-state after another, and in the end brought back famous horses and a prestige that had been forced into recognition. At first, the matter had not seemed so absurd. The emperor wanted the famous horses of the West not merely because of personal preference, but because of the war against the Xiongnu. In the legends circulating in Chang'an, the horses of Daiyuan were almost divine. They were strong, enduring, and suited to long-distance raids. To an emperor who had already grown used to changing the world with cavalry, they were not ordinary tribute, but a military resource. More importantly, in the initial negotiations, the distant kingdom of Daiyuan not only refused to sell the heavenly horses to the Han envoys, but even ambushed and killed members of the mission and seized their goods. For an emperor who had already pushed imperial prestige deep into the western regions, this could not be treated as a normal diplomatic dispute. Envoys killed, horse purchases rejected, Western petty states refusing obedience. All of this could lead to only one result: a military expedition. When the first expedition set out, many still assumed things would proceed as before. The emperor would issue an order, the army would advance, frontier city-states would tremble, and the enemy would soon submit. But they quickly discovered that this time, the enemy was not only behind city walls, it was on the road itself. The road was the enemy. The farther west they went, the less grain there was, and the harder water became to find. Some small states along the way shut their gates and refused entry. Some pretended to obey. Some waited until the Han army had gone far away and then cut off supplies. Before the soldiers had even seen the target kingdom, hunger, disease, and exhaustion had already swallowed them in batches. An army of tens of thousands had already been largely consumed by the time it reached the enemy border. After one engagement, it suffered even heavier losses. In the end, they did not bring back the horses the emperor wanted, nor did they bring back any victory large enough to cover the failure. The first expedition was almost a humiliation. But Emperor Wu did not accept that result. In his life, he rarely stopped because of one defeat. It had been the same in the northern wars, the southern wars, and now the wars of the western regions. In his eyes, failure was not an ending. It was the reason for an even larger investment. So a larger army was levied. More grain was collected. More laborers were dragged onto the road. This time, the city-states along the route also saw Chang'an's determination. This Eastern Empire would rather pay an enormous price than let the killing of its envoys pass in silence. The second expedition finally reached the capital of Daiyuan. The people inside the walls began to waver. The nobles realized that continued resistance would not make the Han army disappear. it would only leave the entire country trapped and exhausted under siege. So, an internal coup occurred. The original king was killed, and the new ruler sought peace with the Han, handing over horses, offering hostages, and acknowledging Han pressure. When the battle report reached Chang'an, it could of course be written as a victory. The Western Kingdom had submitted. The blood-sweating horses had been brought back. The murder of the envoys had been avenged. Han prestige had crossed the desert and pressed down on a still more distant oasis world. Li Guangli was made Marquis of Haishi and stood inside the Jade Gate to receive the empire's reward. To many ministers, this scene seemed to prove that Emperor Wu was still the same heroic ruler who never backed down. Once he made up his mind, even the most distant country had to answer Chang'an's command. But those who truly understood the accounts saw another picture. For these horses, the empire had sent out tens of thousands of lives, consumed hundreds of thousands of animals and war horses, and forced countless laborers out of their villages. Soldiers died in the desert. Laborers died on the road. Grain was consumed along the route before it even reached the battlefield. No matter how magnificent the horses finally brought back to Chang'an were, they could not make up for these losses. They could make the imperial stables more dazzling. They could give court ritual a stronger sense of conquest. But they could not make an already exhausted empire light again. This is the most glaring part of the Dayuan War. It was not meaningless. It consolidated Han prestige in the western regions and taught more distant city-states that killing Han envoys would not go unpunished. It also made the empire's western road clearer, allowing later merchants, envoys, and armies to continue entering Central Asia along that route. But from the empire's immediate perspective, it was absolutely not worth the cost. The gains were too small. The price was too great. It was not the beginning of imperial expansion, but the sign that expansion had begun to deform. Before this, Emperor Wu's wars could still be explained by security. Fighting the Xiongnu was about no longer being oppressed by northern cavalry. Taking Hershi was about controlling the corridor to the west. Destroying Nanyue and Wiman Joseon was about removing frontier kingdoms that obstructed imperial order. But the Dayuan War allowed people for the first time to see clearly that the imperial machine had acquired a momentum of its own. It needed distant targets. It needed new victories. It needed new rewards. It needed new generals. It also needed new reasons to prove that the expansion of the past decades had not been wrong. War was no longer merely a tool for solving problems. War itself began creating new problems, then demanding more war to solve them. The Battle of Dayuan was the peak of Li Guangli's life, and it was also the peak of Emperor Wu and the empire. From the core territory he inherited at his accession, the empire's boundaries had expanded dramatically to the east, south, west, and north. The Great Wall extended into Hershi. Caravans reached the western regions. Frontier offices appeared in places that had once been unimaginable. But every step forward added another layer of cost to maintaining that step. Armies needed grain. Frontier commanderies needed garrisons. Oasis city-states needed rewards and intimidation. Newly conquered lands needed officials, roads, household registers, and law. The empire was expanding, but expansion itself was consuming the empire's foundations. So the army returning beyond the Jade Gate was both a triumph and a warning. Victory was still being written. The bill was still getting thicker. No one could look at the rewards handed out that day and immediately see collapse, but the cracks had already appeared. After the Dayuan War, Emperor Wu's military expansion did not stop immediately. His personal prestige did not immediately fall. But from this moment onward, each new expedition no longer pointed as simply toward glory as before. They increasingly resembled a momentum dragging the empire forward. Victory still existed, but victory no longer made people excited so easily. It began to make people afraid. After the Dayuan War, the empire did not collapse immediately. Chang'an still had palaces, court meetings and victories written on bamboo slips. But the light of victory had begun to dim. Those who had supported the emperor's half-century career of conquest left the stage one after another. The young hero, Wu Qubing, had long since died. The general-in-chief, who had risen from horse slave to supreme commander of the empire, had also died of illness. The empress was still there. The crown prince was still there. But the military network behind them had loosened. New women, new princes, new generals and new families began to grow around the edges of the palace. The old emperor still possessed absolute power, but he was becoming older, sicker, and harder to approach. The crown prince had been heir for more than 30 years. By the time he himself had grandchildren, he was still only waiting. The emperor lived in detached palaces to recover from illness. The crown prince remained in the capital. Between them stood eunuchs, favored officials, envoys, and layers of people carrying messages. By the time a message reached the emperor's ears, it might no longer be the original message. By the time an order came back to the capital, it too might no longer be the original order. It was in this gap that the most dangerous accusation began to spread. Someone was using wooden dolls and curse objects to harm the emperor. To today's audience, this sounds like superstition. But in that age, it was a political crime serious enough to destroy entire families. As long as someone dug up a wooden doll from beneath a palace floor, and as long as someone said there were words on it cursing the emperor, the accused had almost no chance to prove innocence. The investigation began with ordinary officials, soon burned into the inner palace, and then spread from the harem toward the crown prince's residence. The man in charge of the investigation had old grudges against the crown prince. He also feared that once the crown prince ascended the throne, he would be purged. So he exploited the emperor's illness, the emperor's fear, and the broken channel of information between emperor and crown prince, turning an investigation into a purge. Crown Prince Liu Ju was forced into a corner. He sent people to see the emperor, hoping to learn whether this was truly the emperor's order or whether someone was falsely using the emperor's name to frame him. But the roads were blocked. The palace gates could not be entered. Messages could not get through. What he faced was not an open trial, but a charge that had already been placed over his head. If he submitted without resistance, what awaited him might be deposition, execution, or even the destruction of his entire family. So this heir, described in the histories as kind and gentle, made the most dangerous decision of his life. He gathered the guards of the crown prince's palace, falsely claimed to have received the emperor's order, declared that the investigator was committing treason, and personally killed the favored official who had framed him. The palace gates of Chang'an were smashed open. Prisoners were released and formed into the crown prince's temporary force. On the other side, the chancellor, who supported the new imperial in-law faction, the family of Li Guangli, the general who had won the Dayuan War, mobilized regular troops into the capital. The city that had once received countless reports of frontier victories suddenly became a battlefield. For 5 days, the two sides fought. Bodies lay around palace gates, streets, and government offices. In the end, the crown prince's forces were defeated. Liu Ju fled the capital. His mother, Empress Wei Zifu, chose to remain in the palace. Wei Zifu had been empress for 38 years. She had seen her younger brother and nephews sweep across the grasslands. She had seen her son made the future master of the state. Now her son had openly rebelled, failed, and fled. His supporters were being purged. She did not wait for trial. She killed herself in the palace. Soon after, Liu Ju also killed himself while being hunted. A family that had once held both the imperial succession and military glory disappeared from the empire's power structure in a matter of days. The empress was dead. The crown prince was dead. The crown prince's children were dead. Officials who supported the crown prince were purged in large numbers. Before the blood in Chang'an had dried, the emperor had already lost what had once been his most stable future. This was the first layer of crisis before the Luntai Edict, the political crisis. The empire's most dangerous rupture was not on the frontier, but in the system of succession. The Wei family had been destroyed, but the Li family had not truly won. As the investigation deepened, more and more people began speaking up for the crown prince. The emperor also gradually realized that the crown prince might not have been rebelling, but had been forced into a desperate situation. Once the emperor's attitude shifted, those who had pushed the purge would turn from meritorious servants into potential criminals. The chancellor, connected by marriage to Li Guangli, was executed, and the Li family's foundation at court began to collapse. Two families tore at each other over the future throne, and in the end, neither won. The empire no longer had an adult, stable, long-recognized heir. For an old emperor who had ruled for more than half a century, this was more terrifying than any frontier defeat. If a war was lost, another army could be sent. But if the succession broke, the entire state could be dragged into darkness. The second layer of crisis was on the battlefield. In 90 BC, just as the political purges of the Witchcraft disaster were sweeping bloodily through Chang'an, Li Guangli led 70,000 troops on another expedition against the northern steppe. He was supposed to restore the situation with a victory. But this army was drawn into disaster from the start. Supply lines were repeatedly cut by the enemy. Lack of water, getting lost, and collapsing morale followed one another. Blizzards swept across the steppe, and cavalry lost direction in the snow and wind. In the end, the empire's highest-ranking general unfastened his sword and walked into the enemy camp. He surrendered. When the news reached Chang'an, the capital fell into dead silence. Even more frightening was that everyone understood his surrender was not only because of defeat. The political purge in Chang'an had already burned toward his family. If he returned, he would likely face interrogation, execution, and the destruction of his clan. If a general felt safer in the enemy camp than in the capital, then what had broken was not merely the army, but the entire trust system of the empire. A general collapsed on the frontier. The emperor, deep in the palace, faced the ruins he himself had created. This dynasty did not fail suddenly on a single day. After too many years of victory, it was finally crushed by the costs it had accumulated. The third layer of crisis was among the people. Decades of expedition ultimately became 4 words. The world was exhausted and depleted. The steppe wars needed horses, grain, bows, crossbows, armor, more than 100,000 soldiers, and even larger transport corps. Expeditions to the western regions had to cross deserts and oases. Before a cart of grain could reach the front, most of it had already been consumed on the road. The southern mountains, northeastern frontier, and southwestern roads. Every new boundary needed garrisons, officials, roads, granaries, and taxes to maintain it. To refill the treasury, the court monopolized salt and iron, controlled the distribution of materials, imposed property taxes on merchants, and even sold ranks, offices, and pardons. The money on the books may have returned, but the people in the villages disappeared. The judgment left by the histories is extremely cold. In Emperor Wu's final years, the world was exhausted, and the registered households were reduced by half. Population halved does not necessarily mean that everyone who disappeared died on the battlefield. More people were driven away by military service, labor service, taxes, and famine. Some fled into the mountains. Some attached themselves to powerful local families. Some became servants of great households. Some simply disappeared from the government registers. The more the state wanted to conscript, the fewer people it could find. The fewer people it could find, the more it squeezed those who remained registered. In the fourth year of the Yuan Feng era, the Guangdong region alone had 2 million displaced people, including 400,000 without household registration. Later, peasant resistance broke out one after another in Qi, Chu, Yanzhou, Nanyang, and other regions. By then, the empire's problem was no longer simply that the treasury was empty. It was that the people who supported the treasury were escaping from the state's grasp. The mat was still huge. The frontiers were still far away, but the villages and registers at the empire's core had already been hollowed out. It was against this background that the proposal to farm at Luntai was sent to the emperor. Its basic idea was to use military farming to reduce the burden of transporting supplies. The method had merit, but the underlying logic still revolved around the grand narrative of opening new frontiers. Many people, including the chancellor and fiscal officials, assumed the emperor would approve it as he had before. This time he refused. In 89 BC, the Luntai Edict was issued. In this edict, the emperor did not deny his entire life. He did not abandon the western regions. He did not disband the army. He merely admitted that the empire could no longer operate in the old way. The meaning of the edict was clear. Stop the Luntai farming plan, reduce frontier affairs, restore agriculture, prohibit cruel officials and unauthorized tax increases, and allow the state to catch its breath after years of war. This was not a complete change of course, nor was it the tender confession of an old man. It was the admission of a conqueror who rarely admitted mistakes, forced by political, military, and economic crises to acknowledge one thing. The empire was not infinite. Wealth was not infinite. The people were not infinite. And of course, the emperor's own life was not infinite either. In 87 BC, only 2 years after the Luntai Edict was issued, Emperor Wu fell gravely ill. By then, he was 69 years old. More than 50 years had passed since he ascended the throne. Chang'an had changed ministers countless times. The frontiers had changed generals countless times. Even the faces in the harem had changed countless times. The generation that had once supported imperial expansion had almost entirely left the stage. All he could leave behind now was an arrangement. His youngest son was made heir. The child was too young, only 7 years old, and could not control the government. So the emperor entrusted the state to several regents. The most important among them was a minister known for silence, caution, and long proximity to the core of power. His name was Hua Guang. He was the younger half-brother of Hua Qubing, the young hero and Marquis champion. He did not have the brilliance of the boy general or the legend of a frontier commander. But he had what Emperor Wu needed most in his final years: stability. The emperor already knew that this empire could not endure another loss of control over power. The army, the finances, the frontier commanderies, the palace, the imperial in-laws, the regional kings. Any one of these links could drag the state into new chaos. Entrusting the orphaned heir was not a ceremony. It was the last act of risk control. A few days later, the emperor died and was buried in the tomb he had spent many years building during his lifetime. That tomb was enormous, expensive, and solemn. Like his life, it was filled with traces of victory and traces of exhaustion. Later generations have found it difficult to judge him simply. If we look only at the results, he was without doubt one of the most important emperors in Chinese history. He transformed a dynasty that had recovered through rest and restraint into a true continental empire. The powerful northern steppe enemy was forced far back. The He corridor was opened. Roads to the western regions and Central Asia were unlocked. Lingnan, the southeastern mountains, the southwestern plateau, and the northeastern frontier were drawn more deeply into imperial order. He weakened the regional kings, attacked powerful local families, reorganized finance, and built a stronger central government. He made a new political language the common language of the state, and made the emperor not merely the head of one family, but the center of an entire civilizational order. But if we look only at the cost, he was equally dangerous. His wars consumed countless soldiers, laborers, horses, and stores of grain. His fiscal policies pressured merchants and ordinary farmers alike. The imperial economy came close to collapse. His fear and suspicion in old age gave informers room to operate, allowing the Witchcraft disaster to destroy the empress, the crown prince, and a family that had once been his most reliable. He defeated enemies on the frontier, but failed to prevent his own palace from becoming a battlefield. So Emperor Wu's greatness was not pure. He was not a conqueror who brought only glory. What he left behind was an enlarged empire, and also an empire pushed to its limits by expansion. He was also fortunate enough. His first fortune was that he stood on the accumulated achievements of his predecessors. Without the decades of restraint, recovery, and grain storage under the previous two emperors, he could not have launched such long wars. His second fortune was that when he most needed victory, he encountered the general-in-chief who had risen from horse slave, and the young commander who appeared almost like lightning. And when he most needed stability, he left behind a regent capable of holding the court together. His third fortune was that his direct descendants saved both the empire and his reputation. Many years later, the only surviving great-grandson from the crown prince's family after the Witchcraft disaster ascended the throne, reorganized the state, and continued the dynasty's strength. Because of the later stability and restoration, Emperor Wu's conquests did not collapse quickly like those of the Qin. They were slowly digested and transformed into institutions, frontier commanderies, roads, and historical memory. His legendary life proves that behind every gain, there is always a price and a sacrifice. Emperor Wu did not escape that price. But after his death, the empire was not ultimately crushed by the cost. That is why, in the end, people remembered what he gained. And they have sung of it for 2,000 years.